Git and GitHub are essential tools for version control and collaboration in the world of programming. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to harness these tools to efficiently manage your projects and to work effectively with others. So let's go ahead and get started.
Now, before we talk about our lesson plan, let me make a few key notes. The first is that Git can be quite painful, so try to be patient as you work through this material. The second is that there are many ways to use Git. The most powerful and flexible way is to use the command line, so you write code directly into your terminal that tells Git what to do. But mastering this skill can take quite some time, so we won't be using this interface. Though later on in your developer career, I would recommend you take some time out to learn this. We could also use the VS Code interface, which provides a nice graphic user interface for Git. And finally, we could use the official GitHub desktop app, which also provides a graphic user interface for Git. In my experience, GitHub desktop is the least painful and the most helpful of the different graphic user interfaces for Git. So this is what we're going to be using in the video. And here's our lesson plan. After an introduction, we'll set you up with github.com and GitHub Desktop. Then we're going to go through a series of what I call action sequences. These are just common things you're going to be doing in Git. In the first one, we'll create a new repo, we'll commit it, and we'll publish it. In the second, we'll edit that repo, we'll commit, and then push our changes. Then we'll take a detour and talk about Git vocabulary in theory. Then we will pull changes from a remote repository. We'll learn to add a new collaborator. We'll learn how to access old versions of our files. And then we'll learn how to fork and clone a repo. So those are a lot of new words, a lot of new vocabulary terms. But by the end of this video, you should feel confident with those.
Now let's start off by thinking about what are the problems that are solved by Git and GitHub. The first problem solved by Git and GitHub is version control. Have you ever struggled with a multiple document or code version problem like this, where you think you're done with the project and you call it maybe just project? You send that version off, you get some feedback, you call it maybe project revised or project 2, and then you think you're finally done, so you call it project final, but then some new changes come along and you call it project final 2, and so on and so forth, and you have this nonsensical set of file names. This is a big problem. Services like Google Docs have solved this by giving you a nice history of your revisions, but for code and for programming, this is best solved by Git. The second problem that Git and GitHub help us solve is collaboration. So imagine you're working on a project and you want to collaborate on it with someone else. What's the best way to do that? One way you may think to do is just keep sending a bunch of email threads. Hey, here's the changes I made. And then they send you back a new version saying, here are the new changes I made, and so on and so forth. As you can imagine, even with 2 people, this can get unnecessarily annoying. But imagine working with 50 people like that. It becomes absolutely impossible. So Git and GitHub will provide us a way to fix this problem. Now I've been talking about Git and GitHub, and indeed these are 2 different things. Let's try to distinguish them. What is Git? Git is an open source version control system that helps you track changes to your code or to your documents over time, as you can see represented in that diagram. And what is GitHub? Well, GitHub is a service which helps Git users collaborate. So Git is kind of the original system, and GitHub is something built on top of Git that helps users collaborate better. So to get started working with Git and GitHub on your computer, we're going to go through 3 main initial steps. The first is we're going to create an account on GitHub Online. So I'm going to walk you through that. And then you're going to install GitHub Desktop, which is a local software running on your computer. And then we'll connect these 2 services, GitHub Desktop, with your GitHub account in the authentication process. Okay, so let's go through the process of making a new GitHub account. So I'm going to go to github.com and look for the sign up button. So this may change depending on when you come to this page. At the moment, it seems you can just sign up right here on the home page. So I make a password. You should use a good password here, since your GitHub is where you will keep a lot of your important code. And your username is also very important because we're going to use GitHub to share our work with other developers. And even our personal website is going to use this username. And now I just need to go to my email, I imagine, to verify. All right, so I put in the code and I'm ready. And we're going to, of course, use the free GitHub. Continue for free. Okay, and we are now at our GitHub homepage. And that's actually all we need to do for now. If you want, you can go ahead and click around to explore. But for me, that's all I need for now. So now we're going to try to install GitHub Desktop on a Windows computer. So here I am on my Windows virtual machine, and I just search GitHub Desktop, and it looks like the first result here, download for Windows, is going to be what I need. So I just click on this and I wait for that to download. And so then I go to my downloads folder, and here is the application file. Let's double click on that to install it. So that took about 1 minute to install. And now I'm going to want to connect GitHub Desktop to my online GitHub account. Conveniently, there's a button for that here, sign in to github.com. So I click on that. I use any of the browsers I feel like. Let's use that one. And now the account you just created, you're going to sign in with that. So let me do that. KenDavidN -TGC, and then my password in there. And let's go ahead and sign in. And now I'm going to authorize GitHub Desktop to connect to my online GitHub account, authorize. And I will click here to always allow GitHub to open links of this type, and click to open that. And now it will open my GitHub Desktop. And now you see it has filled this in on here. So it put in a name and then a special email here. So you can use that and click on finish. And this is now your GitHub Desktop home. And so in the next section, we're going to show you how to use this.
Now, after you've downloaded and set up GitHub Desktop, there's a specific option that it is useful to change. So you go to File here and then Options, and click on Integrations, and set your external editor here to Visual Studio Code if it's not already set that way, and click on Save.
Now, if you're on a Mac, let's see how you can install GitHub Desktop. So you open your browser or your Google, and you just search for GitHub Desktop. And we're going to click the first link. And as you can see, it recognizes that we are on Mac OS, and we can click that main link. If it doesn't do the correct recognition, you can look at these other links. But I'm going to click this one, download for Mac OS. I click allow. Now it looks like when you download the application, it already comes unpackaged. So then all you need to do now is just drag this from your downloads folder into your applications folder. Okay, so find your applications folder, drag it in there, and now you should have that app, and we can double click on it to open it. In my case, it says I need to install Rosetta, so I click install. So that took about 1 minute to install. And now I'm going to want to connect GitHub Desktop to my online GitHub account. Conveniently, there's a button for that here, sign in to github.com. So I click on that. I use any of the browsers I feel like. Let's use that one. And now the account you just created, you're going to sign in with that, KenDavidN -TGC, and then my password in there. And let's go ahead and sign in. And now I'm going to authorize GitHub Desktop to connect to my online GitHub account, authorize. And I will click here to always allow GitHub to open links of this type, and click to open that. And now it will open my GitHub Desktop. And now you see it has filled this in on here. So it put in a name and then a special email here. So you can use that and click on finish. And this is now your GitHub Desktop home. And so in the next section, we're going to show you how to use this.
Now, after you've downloaded and set up GitHub Desktop, there's a specific option that it is useful to change. So you go to File here and then Options, and click on Integrations, and set your external editor here to Visual Studio Code if it's not already set that way, and click on Save. So now we are done with the introduction, and we are done with setting up github.com and GitHub Desktop. We will now move to action sequence 1, where we will create a new repo, commit, and then publish. We're going to create a new repo, and then we'll publish it to GitHub. Before we dive into this, let me give some brief overview of some of the key terms here. Firstly, a repo, which is short for a repository, is just basically your project folder where you are putting in your code. And this can either be local, that means it's on your computer, or remote, that means it's stored on an online repository hub somewhere, such as github.com. So, like I said, the local repo is the version of the folder on your local computer, and the remote repo is the version of the folder on an online service like GitHub. Sometimes you will hear this called the origin. And now on your local repo, usually you're going to have a working copy. So that is the version of the file that you're currently working with. And then each time you commit, a commit is kind of like a save, then all those past saves are getting stored in a Git directory. So you make some changes, you save, which is the same thing as commit. And then to publish is to take your local stuff and get it on the internet. So to transfer it to github.com. So back to our action sequence, we're going to create a new repository. So we create a new folder. We'll commit some changes. That means we'll just make some changes, then save them. And then we'll send it over to the internet by publishing it to GitHub. So here I am in GitHub Desktop, and then I click on File at the top left, and then New Repository. and I'll call it something simple like my first repo. And if you want, you can give it a description, but that's not required. And then for this next option, you can decide where exactly on your computer you want to put it. When you download GitHub Desktop, it usually creates a GitHub folder that will contain all of your Git repos. So you can usually just leave in this default. You can also initialize the repository with a README. A README is just going to be a file where you can describe your repository. And then this next one you should definitely do is add a git ignore. So a git ignore will tell Git to ignore certain types of files. And this is very useful if you have, for example, very large data sets, or you have maybe API keys inside of certain files. So for this, we're going to select the Python template for the git ignore. So scroll through and find Python, and we click Create Repository. So now that we've created this repository, we want to open it up in VS Code and make some changes to it. So I'm going to right click and then open in Visual Studio Code. So right click here on this top left section and then open in Visual Studio Code. And I click to trust the authors of all files in GitHub. Yes. And it tells me Git is not found. You can ignore that. It's saying that because we're using GitHub Desktop and not Git from the terminal. So just ignore. So now you can see there are already a few files in this repo. The first is the README. So we can open that and let's make some changes and say, this is my first repo. And I press Ctrl S to save that. And let's also open the git ignore. So the git ignore, as you can see, has a number of different files, and it's going to tell Git to not track these files. So don't send them over to GitHub. One of the important files here is your venv stuff here. So you remember that when we set up virtual environments, we install lots and lots of packages. And we don't want to have to send this up to GitHub because that will make the whole process really slow. So here we're telling Git to ignore that. And this git ignore file is editable, so if you ever wanted to add some new things in here, you could do that. You'll also see a local settings.py file. And if you recall, our local settings file is where we put some of our API keys that we don't want to send up to GitHub. So those are just some of the things in the git ignore. You also have this git attributes file, but you can ignore that. So now let's just make a new file and call it test.py. And we'll put some simple code here like print 2 plus 2. And let's run the code. And in the terminal, we see the answer of 4. Okay, so now we have added in some code into this repo, and we'd like to send that code up to the internet. So we've reopened GitHub Desktop, and what you'll notice now is that under here, under My First Repository, GitHub is tracking the changes you have made to that file. So here for readme.md, you can see it tracks that we added a blank line here, and then a line with this is my first repo. And we can also see that we added the test.py file with this new line. So what we're going to put in this box here is a message that describes the changes we're making. And since we're just starting out the repo, we can just call this new repo. And we click on this big blue button here that says commit to main. So now we're saving it. And then we click on this other big blue button that says publish repository. And this will send it up to the internet. You can either keep the code private, which means only you or your collaborators will be able to see it. And later I'll show you how to add a collaborator. Or you can uncheck this, and that will make it public, and that means anyone on the internet can see it. Since this is just a test repository, we can uncheck this to make it public, and we click on Publish Repository. And now we can right-click again here on the top left, and there's an option here to view on GitHub. So we're going to github.com, and we can see that new repo that we just created, my first repo. We can click into any of these files to see what is contained. For example, in test.py, we can see print 2 plus 2. So that's it now for action sequence 1. We created a new repository, we committed our changes, and then we published that repo to GitHub. So you can imagine then that if you're working on some analysis and you want to share your analysis with your colleagues, instead of sending a bunch of emails back and forth, what you do is you create a repository, you publish it to GitHub, and then your colleagues can see it from GitHub there. And each time you make a change, you just push up your new change to GitHub, and they'll be able to see the updates. Now let's look at a slight variation of what we just did. So instead of creating a new repo and publishing it to GitHub, we'll add an existing folder to GitHub. So imagine you have some previous work and now you want to add it up to GitHub. How will you do that? Well, the easiest way to do that is just to reproduce the steps that we had before. But then when you create this new repository, you just copy your files into that repo that you just created. So let's go ahead and implement this. I'll open up GitHub Desktop again. And now I'm going to make another new repository. And I'll call this one maybe Graph Courses Python _git, and I leave the local path as is, initialize with the readme, set the git ignore to Python, and then create repository. And now I'm going to right click here on the top left, click on show in Explorer. And so as you can see, this is just a regular folder on my computer, And what I'll do in this case is I'll copy all of my previous Graph Courses Python stuff into here. Okay, so let me click now on my desktop. This is a right click and open that in new tab. And let me drag that to bring that to a new window. So here is my Graph Courses Python folder with a bunch of the stuff I've been doing so far. And let's imagine I want all of that to go on GitHub so I can track it easily. So I just press Ctrl A to select everything, or you could drag to select, and I'll just move it all over to my new folder. Okay, so now I've moved all of my work over to this new folder that is tracked with Git. And if I go back to GitHub desktop, you will see that all those changes now are being reflected in this list of changes. And I can give a commit message like setup and click to commit to main. And now let's publish this repository to GitHub. Now, because this contains all of my personal code for the Graph Courses Python class, I will keep this private. So I'll leave this checked in and then I click publish repository. So only me will be able to see this code. But it's helpful nonetheless for me to track my code over time. So click on publish repo and then right click again here at the top left and view on GitHub. So now I can see all of my code and I can see that it's labeled as private. Okay, so we're done with action sequence 1.1. Now here is a practice question for you on that action sequence. I want you to create a new repo called Hello World, then add a new script called main.py to that repo, and it should have the following code, print hello world, and then publish this repo to your online GitHub account. Now let's go on to action sequence 2. Here we're going to make some changes in an existing repository. We'll commit our changes and then we push that to github.com. So going through that again with VS Code, we update some code, we commit, and then we push. So let's go to VS Code to do that. I'm going to go to File and then Open Folder, and I'll reopen my first repo. And for this test.py file, I will add in another line that says print 3 plus 3. Okay, so we've added this change. Let's go to GitHub Desktop, and we'll click here on the top left to go back to view my first repo. And we can see that it tracks that new line with a plus and this green highlighting. And you can also see that it gives us a default commit message, update test.py. We can leave in that default, click commit to main, and then we push to origin. And now if we right click and view on GitHub, you will see that beside this test.py file, we now have the commit message, update test.py. And if we click into the file, we can see that it has been updated. You can also click on the history at the top right. And from here, we can see the past commits. And you have this little small button at the right side, which is for view code at this point. So we could view code at the initial point, and you can see it's 2 plus 2. And we go back, and then we click on the next one, and we can see it's 2 plus 2 and 3 plus 3. So that way we can keep track of all the versions. And to return to the home page for this repo, I'll just click here at the top left on my first repo. Okay. All right, so that was a straightforward action sequence. Here's a practice question for you. I want you to open the Hello World repository that you created for the previous practice question and change the code in the main.py file from whatever it is to print hello universe. Commit this change and push it to your online GitHub account. So we've now seen action sequence 1 of creating a repo, committing and publishing, and action sequence 2 of editing, committing and pushing. Let's now take a brief detour and discuss Git vocabulary and theory. So some key Git vocabulary terms, and this is revision by now because I introduced them earlier on, is that the repo is your project folder, which can be local or remote. The local version is the one on your computer, and the remote one is the one on an online service like GitHub, sometimes called the origin. And within your local repo, you usually have a working copy, so that's the current version of the files you're working on, and then this .git directory, which is a folder, and sometimes that folder is hidden, that is keeping track of your different file versions. So now what are some key Git verbs involved in this? You have the verb commit, which is to save the current version of your files to the Git directory. You have to push, which is to upload your commits to the remote repo. And the first time you're pushing things over to the remote repo, we usually call that publish. And the opposite of the word push is, of course, pull. So to pull means to get the latest commits from the remote repo. So this is in case someone else changed the remote repo, maybe one of your collaborators, and you want to pull that down to your local computer. That's the term we use, pull. And the first time you're getting things down to your local computer, we use this term clone. Okay, so with these 5 Git verbs, commit, push, pull, publish, and clone, you can do 90% of the things you will need to do with Git. Here is some practice on that vocabulary. I want you to match the words with their definitions. So pause the video and try this out. And here are the answers, if you are wondering. So now let's talk about how collaboration fits into this picture. So far we've been talking about your local repo and this online github.com repo. But what if someone else wants to work with you? Well, it's really quite simple. So they will take your remote repo and clone it down to their local computer. And so just as you have your local copy of the repo, the other person will have their local copy of the repo. So this is the general workflow. You make a change, you push it to GitHub, and they pull it. Then they make a change, they push that to GitHub, and you pull it down. Okay, so based on that, test your understanding with this Office chat quiz. So we have a fake conversation between two people, Adam and Bob. And Adam says, "Hey Bob, did you start the analysis yet? If you did, can you dash your dash to dash so that I can dash it to my computer?" And here you have 4 options. And then Bob responds, and there you have 3 options. And then there's a final response also with 3 options. So pause the video and see if you can fill in these blanks. And here are the answers. Now let's talk very briefly about something called branches. So in this diagram that we created, the Git directory looks linear. So it's like a linear sequence of changes. But this is not necessarily the case. So what often happens for software development is that there's what we call a main branch or a master branch. And then when one developer wants to work on a certain feature, they will branch out and give some custom name to this branch. And they'll do their work there. And you could even have a sub branch. And then when they're done with all of that, they will create what's called a pull request. So that's PULL request. And then merge their changes with the main branch. However, when you're working as a data analyst, usually most of your analysis is quite linear and there aren't many dependencies between different people's parts of the job. So data analysts may not use branches as much as other developers. So because of that, we won't do any practice on branches, but later on you could investigate this. So for our next action sequence, let's think about pulling changes from remote. So like I said, when you're collaborating with other people, they may make changes and push them to the remote repo, and you need to pull those changes down to your local computer. But because you are working on this exercise solo, then what we're going to do is we'll simulate being that other person by just making a change directly on github.com. So you can make changes directly on github.com. So let's go back now to github.com and my first repo, and we'll open up the test.py file. And you see this pencil icon here at the top right of that file. This will allow us to edit that file directly in here. And let's add another line, print 4+4. And from here, I can commit changes. I'll leave in the default commit message and then commit directly to the main branch. Click commit. So now I've made those changes in the remote repo. Let's go back to the local version and see how we can get our changes. So first I open VS Code and I can see that still currently it's 2+2 and 3+3. But now let me execute a sequence here on GitHub desktop that will update that. So the first thing is to fetch origin. At the top right here, you have this fetch origin button. Let's click that. And that will just check the online repository to see if there's anything new that we can pull. And indeed, it seems there is something new. So we can click to pull origin. And after a few moments, the changes should now be reflected on our local repo. So if I open up now my first repo, you can see that that change we made online, print 4+4, has now been reflected. Nice and easy. Okay, so here's a practice question for you on that. I want you to reproduce a similar process on your Hello World project. So you go to GitHub and you change the code from what it currently is, Hello Universe, to Goodnight Moon, and then pull those changes down to your local repo. So pause the video and try that out. Okay, so now we've seen how to pull from remote. Let's see how to add a new collaborator. So I open up my browser to github.com again, and I click at the top left to go back to the home page for this repo. And then at the top right, there's this settings button, which I can click on that takes me to this list of settings. And one of the first settings on this left sidebar is collaborators. And if I scroll down a bit, I can see this button to add collaborators. So these people will have direct edit access to my repo. So I click on add people. And from here, you can add a collaborator. So everyone on GitHub has a unique username and also a unique email, I guess. So from here, you can find them. For example, I can find myself, Ken David N. Okay, so now you know how to do this, but don't bother sending me an invite so you don't clog up my GitHub inbox. And here's a quick illustration of that sequence. All we're doing there is we're giving this person, imagine they're called Bob, edit access to our remote repo so they can also push and pull from it. Next, let's talk about accessing old versions of your files. So as you know, Git, of course, is tracking your previous commits, your previous saves. And these are available both locally on your computer or online on github.com. And there are quite a few ways to go back to those previous edits. But the easiest way is just to go to github.com, go to that previous version of the file, and then copy the code out from there. And then you can paste it in the current version of your file. This is not technically the best way, but it's definitely the easiest and the most pain-free. Okay, so like I said, we're going to go to github.com, we'll view the old commits, and then we can copy or download them. There are ways to do this locally, but it involves more steps. So let's go to github.com and look at how to do that. Here I am on my first repo, and I click again on test.py. I think we've done this before, but let's do it again. At the top right, you can see this history button that lets us see the history of this file. And then in this right-hand section, we can view the code at each of these points. So if I click on the second one, view code at this point, you can see the version of the code at that point. So I could just copy all of this code, go back to my local repo, and use that to restore this. Okay, so just try some practice on this one. Navigate to your Hello World repository and browse some of the old commits of your files. You don't have to revert anything, just browse them to make sure that you know where all the buttons are. Now for our next action sequence, let's see how to fork and then clone a repository. The basic idea here is that there's someone else's repo on github.com and you want to make a copy of that on your own system so that you can work independently of them. And the word independent there is important. When you fork, you're creating a copy that's independent of that person's repo. So let's see a quick example of how to do this. So we've created a repo on GitHub by the Graph Courses and it's called Fork Practice. And we're going to go to this and try to fork it, then clone it. Okay? So let's go to that link over there. I open my browser and type github.com/the-graph-courses/fork-practice. Make sure you spell that correctly. And that will take you to this repo over here. And then I can click on this button here to fork the repository. At the top right, fork your own copy of the Graph Courses. You can either leave it as the same name or give it your own name. In my case, I'll give it my own name. I'll call it Fork Practice My Copy. And we leave it set to copy the main branch only and create fork. So now I have that on my list of repositories. If I click on my username here at the top left and go back to my home page and I click on my repositories, I should see that forked repo here. So Fork Practice My Copy. Okay, let's click back into it now and let's see how to clone it. So to clone it, we can use this big green button here. We click on that button and then we click Open with GitHub Desktop. So this is going to clone it. I'll click to always allow GitHub to open links of this type and click on Open. And now it brings up this pop-up asking me to confirm where in my local computer I want this folder to be kept. And I can leave it in GitHub. I'll click on Clone. And GitHub Desktop asks me how I'm planning to use this fork. Do I want to contribute to the parent project or use it for my own purposes? In this case, it's just for my own purposes. So I can click that and that will set some nice defaults for me. Click Continue. And now I have that copy on my local computer. I'm going to right click here and then open it in Visual Studio Code just so I can see what is the code inside of it. You see that in here we have a main.py file and also a main.r file. And here we have this nice message. Hello, just checking that you know how to fork and clone a repository. This is a simple Python script that prints a message, welcome to the repository. Very good. So we've successfully forked. So now let's go over everything that we have learned. We saw how to create a new repo using GitHub Desktop, how to commit changes, and then how to publish all of that up to the remote, that is up to github.com. Then we saw how to make edits in the repo, commit those changes, and then push. We also saw how to pull changes from remote by simulating being a collaborator that made some changes here on the remote. Then I showed you how to add a new collaborator so that they can also make changes to your repo. I showed you how you can access old versions of your files by going to github.com and clicking on the history of each file. And then finally, I showed you how you can get someone else's work by forking that and then cloning that to your local computer. So congrats on getting through this lesson. You are now empowered with this amazing skill of version control, and you know how to get your work up to github.com so you can collaborate with others. I hope this skill comes in handy soon. I'll say bye-bye, and I'll see you in the next video.
For more resources, visit our website, where you can track your progress, access interactive quizzes and lesson notes, and connect with our teachers and other learners like you. And if you'd like a more guided experience, we also offer live online bootcamps with expert help. So join us at thegraphcourses.org to start your learning journey today.